Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A little music to start off today. Yes, Aretha Franklin, get us started today. So this is the Fuzzy Chin edition of the Skidmore Chronicles, and we're going to begin today by talking about global inequality and strategies of development. So this little illustration gives you an idea of how unequal things are in today's world. And so does this data. Shows that the 85 richest people on earth control wealth equal to that of the bottom 3.5 billion. And the wealthiest 1/10 of 1% of adults on the planet account for 20% of all global wealth. The top 1%, 50% of all global wealth. So wealth includes not just income, but it's accumulated resources. So it includes things like homes and land and property, stocks and bonds, gold, precious items like for the rich, they collect art and yachts and things like that. So basically, wealth is very unequally distributed. This shows us income. And there are three different ways of looking at the distribution of income in the world. The first, called Concept One, and I'm borrowing here from an economist named Branko Milanovic. And he's using a measure called the Gini coefficient. Basically, what you need to understand about the Gini coefficient is just that it's a measure of inequality. It ranges from 0 to 1. So you'll see here that the effective measures in this particular chart range from a little over 40.45 up to a high of somewhere around 0.7. Now, 0 would mean that everyone is exactly equal. So if all the people in the world received exactly the same income, then the Gini coefficient, as it's called, would be 0. On the other hand, if one person out of the 7 billion plus people on Earth had all the income and everyone else had none, then it would be Gini coefficient of 1. So obviously, neither of those are possible scenarios. So Gini coefficient tends to vary in the middle of the scale. But these variations, even though it's a very abstract way of thinking about it, are really quite significant. They do indicate even what look like modest differences in the Gini coefficient add up to actually major differences in wealth and income. So Concept One basically takes all of the countries in the world. It then lines them up from top to bottom according to the average per capita income within each country. So you take the overall GDP, you divide it by the number of people in the country, you come up with an average per capita GDP, and then you compare countries according to that scale. Well, if you do that, you find that between 1950 and the year 2000, there was a fairly steady upward movement with a couple of jogs where it became steeper, but around 1960 and 1980. But generally, there was a pretty steady upward trend as inequality among different countries grew over that half century. And then you'll notice in the first decade of this century, And if this continued, we'd see it as well, although you'll notice a little jog upward at the end there. But in general, using the red line, you notice that there was some modest decrease in inequality according to this concept one measure, looking at comparing per capita income across countries. Even so, however, even in 2000, I think it was 11 or 12, 2011, inequality remained much higher than it had been back in the 60s and 50s, 60s, and 70s. However, the problem with that measure is that a lot of countries, some countries are much bigger than other countries. So China and India have about 1.2, 1.3 billion people, whereas Jamaica or Costa Rica or Burundi have much smaller populations. And yet, in the concept one comparison, they're actually counted the same. China doesn't weigh any more than small country. So what we do in concept two is we also line up countries from top to bottom according to per capita income, but then we attach greater weight to countries with higher levels of population. And so China and India count together for about 40% on this scale, whereas smaller countries count an infinitesimal amount. So with those big countries playing a bigger role in influencing the Gini coefficient, you see a very different outcome, right? Over that half century, up until, 40 years, up until from 1950 to 1990, you had a very slight decrease in inequality or Gini coefficient by this measure. And then it accelerated in the 90s, and then it began a steeper decline in the 2000s. So that by the year 2011, the Gini coefficient was, it looks like maybe, it's hard to tell exactly, but maybe 52, 53.52 or 53, whereas it had started out over 0.65. Well, that's a substantial decline in inequality, and most of the gains were concentrated in the last 10 to 20 years of this chart. So what's going on here? Well, what it tells us is that those two big countries, China and India, especially starting around 1990, but slightly before then, were growing faster than most countries in the world. And therefore, because their weight shows up more heavily in this concept two measure, it made a bigger difference in reducing inequality. So China and India, China grew over about a 30, 40-year period, 8 to 10% a year, whereas India grew 6 to 7% a year. So, while Europe and the US were growing maybe 2 or 3% a year. So there was some catch-up going on there, which allowed, therefore, the overall inequality using these measures to decline. However, notice that because China and India were so poor back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, the overall absolute measure of inequality, according to concept two, was much higher than it was under concept one. It was only very recently that the two measures kind of converged at the end there. Now, what is that concept three? Notice there's no line, there's just 6 dots. And those dots are much higher than either of the other measures. So concept three shows the highest degree of inequality by the Gini coefficient. So why is that? Concept three doesn't compare countries, and it doesn't, ignore differences within countries, because as we know, not everybody within a country stands at the average per capita income. There are plenty of inequalities within countries. That's an average, but that means there's a lot of people above and a lot of people below. So concept 3 takes all the individuals in the world, starting with Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or whoever happens to be on top at a particular given week or month. You start off with the richest person in the world, and you go to the second richest, the third richest, and you go on down through 7 billion plus people till you get to the poorest. And then you use the Gini coefficient to figure out the overall level of inequality using individuals as the point of comparison instead of countries. Well, if we do that, then you see, first of all, that inequality is much higher using individuals as the measurement. You can also see that there's no clear trend here, whereas there is a trend toward declining inequality in this century under both the concept 1 and 2. Concept 3, there's no real pattern there. In fact, the very last dot is just slightly higher than the first dot. The reason there's only 6 dots is because we only have 6 measurement points. We don't have as much data for this concept of inequality as we do for the first 2. So limited data, the data that we have shows a very high level of inequality among individuals and no clear pattern toward decline. Goes up, down, up, down. All right, that gives us some sense of trends in overall inequality on a global scale. Now, this is a really interesting chart because what it does is it divides the world into all the individuals from the richest to the poorest along the bottom axis, the country ventile. And then it divides those into each 1/20th. So there are 20 different points here on this scale, each representing 5% of the overall index. So at the top you'd have the 20 represents the top, the average income for the top 5%. At the bottom, you would have number 1 represents the average income for the bottom 5% of income earners globally, looking at individuals, etc. So we have, the distribution of income both among different countries, looking at individuals. Now, what you then look at is the percentile of the world income distribution on a 1 to 100 scale on the left side. And the way you read this is that it's for the United States in green. Basically, what it's saying is that the average income of the bottom 5% of Americans falls at the 60th percentile on the global scale. So the average person in the bottom 5% of Americans has a higher income than 60% of the world's people. And then if you go up, when you get up to about, the average for between, let's say, 25% and 30% of on the American income distribution, well, then you find that those people have higher income than about 85% of the world's population. And then those at the far right are those who earn the most, and they're at the very top of the income distribution, both in the U.S. and globally. So that's already, and the red dotted line represents the average income globally. So basically, the very poorest Americans are about at the average for the global distribution as a whole. That's pretty revealing. Now, let's look then at India. India, you see, it starts down at the very bottom. What that means is that the poorest Indians are among the poorest people in the world. There's the the average income of the bottom 5% of Indians, there's almost very few people globally who are poorer than the poorest Indians. What about the richest Indians? Well, the richest Indians are just above the average income of the top 5%. It's just barely above the global average. And it would fall basically equivalent to the average income of the bottom 5% of Americans. So the top 5% of income earners in India have average income about the same as the poorest Americans. So that's pretty astonishing. Now, if we got up to the top 1% of Indians, the top 1/10 of 1%, it's a big country, 1.2 billion people. So there are wealthy Indians. It's just their tiny slice of Indian population. Now, if you look at Brazil, there is a country with the most extreme distribution of inequality. So you notice that Brazil, which is in blue, starts down at the very bottom. What that means is that the poorest Brazilians are right there with the poorest people in the world. On the other hand, it's maybe hard to see but the richest Brazilians, the average income, the top 5% of Brazilians, is right up there with the United States. So the richest Brazilians are among the richest people in the world. And then the rest of Brazilian society is spread in between. What that tells us is that the gap between rich and poor in Brazil is greater than any of the other examples here on this chart, and is among the highest in the world. Now, let's look historically. You might think that, well, hasn't income inequality always been extreme in the world? Well, in fact, it hasn't. And the reason it hasn't is because for most of history, most people's income was barely enough to survive. They had just barely above subsistence level, as we call it. And there were a few rich people, but they represented a tiny, tiny part of the population. So the great majority of people were roughly equal, and with a very few people living much better. But even the wealthiest people in the Middle Ages were not nearly as wealthy as the top Americans today. Now, if we look at the distribution of economic power and production globally, we get this chart. And what's very interesting here is it shows that in 1750, Europe and the United States and Japan together, three of the wealthy countries today, well, their income, their share of world manufacturing output, which is the core of we don't have good data on income, so we're using this as kind of a proxy. But the share of the US, Japan, and Europe together was less than 30%. And, well, actually about 27%. Whereas that of the so-called third world here, it's developing countries, basically Latin America, Africa, Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, all of those countries combined, their manufacturing output amounted to about 73% of the total in the world. And in fact, in this period, the average European citizen, their income was only about 50% higher than the average Chinese. So income differentials across regions of the world were not very large. And the United States at 1/10 of 1% on the eve of the revolution. Fast forward to 1900, Europe almost triples from 23% of the world manufacturing output to 62%. The United States jumps up to almost a quarter. Japan's actually declines a little bit. So the US and Europe together come to account for about 85% of global manufacturing, as compared to less than 24% in 1750. On the other hand, the rest of the developing world fell to 11%. How do we account for this? So basically, there are two answers. One answer is that the Industrial Revolution allowed the rich countries to pull away from the rest. The other answer is that colonialism and colonial exploitation pushed down the economic potential of much of the rest of the world. If you think about, for instance, the impact of slavery on West Africa, or you think about the plunder of the resources of Latin America, if you think about the colonization of much of the developing world. So the income gap between rich countries and poor countries is actually fairly recent. This shows the shift from 2,000 years ago till today in terms of where the economic center of gravity in the world was. And you can see it moving westward as Europe became more and more economically dominant, even moving toward the Western Hemisphere as the United States industrialized and grew so quickly in the mid-20th century. But then starting around 1950, the weight of development in the rest of the world starts to pull the center of gravity back eastward until today, where because of the rise of Japan and China and East Asia, the center of gravity is back similar to where it was in the past. This is another way of looking at that period since 1990, where the huge gap that had developed between the rich countries, the Europe, US, Japan, and the rest of the world, you can see how large that gap is. Well, over these last 30 years or so, there's been a very rapid reversal, so that the developed countries and the emerging economies have traded places. And now the overall GDP of the developing world is actually higher than that of the developed world due to higher economic growth rates. Here's another way of looking at it. You can see that between 1980 and 2015, looking at purchasing power parity, that's one way of measuring and comparing income across countries. This way of measuring accounts for differences in prices. Of course, it's price for many things, especially labor-intensive items, is cheaper in the developing world than in Europe or the US or Japan. So accounting for that, we see here that Europe's share of the global economy has fallen from 26% to 17%, the US from 20 to 19, Japan from 7 to 5, but China grew from 3% all the way up to 19%. Enormous increase. India from 3% to 8%. So those are the big drivers of reduced global inequality. Now, what's interesting is the U.S. actually fell only by 1%. And in fact, if you look at another way of measuring income, and that's called exchange rates, where you're looking at you're valuing income according to the value of each currency traded on currency markets. And using that measure, the U.S. actually hasn't. The U.S. share of the economy remains about 25% of the global economy. So that's quite substantial. So China and India are catching up, but the U.S. really hasn't fallen, even in relative terms, compared to the world as a whole. Now, how do countries develop? What strategies have developing countries used to try to increase economic growth, to industrialize, to catch up with the first world? Well, the short answer is many different strategies. There is no single recipe or formula for success. And there are a number of different ways of combinations that have been tried out, some of which have succeeded better than others. But you can find examples of success with very different strategies. So some countries, for instance, have relied heavily upon the state. So, for instance, planned economies like the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. And then you have very market-oriented economies like the United States or Great Britain, and then you have in between, like China today is a mixed economy. It has much more state intervention than the U.S. or Britain, but it is much more market-oriented than, say, the old Soviet Union. Then you have extensive and intensive growth. And this is kind of interesting. So extensive growth means you put more inputs into the machine and you get more output. So if you come up with a way of putting more people at work, if you put more land under cultivation, if you extract more raw materials, if you put in more labor and land and raw materials, more capital, higher savings rate, higher investment rate, you can get higher GDP growth, right? But the problem is that succeeds only as long as you can find more inputs. So eventually you run out of new land. You've put everybody to work that's capable of working. Your savings rate is high as it can go. Your extraction of raw materials is at the highest sustainable rate. So then you reach a point where growth begins to peter out. How do you get it started again? You have to shift to intensive growth, which is using the same resources or sometimes even fewer resources in a more efficient manner. So you're able to put in the same or fewer and get more out. And that's done through productivity increases, that you're able to get more corn off the same acre of land, or you're able to, the same worker using machinery is able to produce more than they could without machinery. So many countries start off doing extensive development, but then at some point they have to shift to intensive development. And it turns out that only a minority of countries have done that successfully. It's a very difficult trick to pull off because it requires the right incentive structure and it requires innovation. Now, another distinction among ways to develop is which sector of the economy takes the leading role. Agriculture, which was for most of human history by far the most dominant kind of economic production. Raw materials, extracting oil or minerals or other kinds of timber, or industry, industrialization, manufacturing, which could be light industry, heavy industry, high-tech industry, different types of industry. And then finally, services, produce, banking, legal services, getting your hair cut, all of those kinds of non-tangible kinds of products. So what tends to happen is that countries start out with agrarian economies. They shift toward raw materials production, depending on whether they have much, what kind of geography they have and whether they are rich or poor in raw materials. Then they shift toward industry and then finally toward services. The U.S. today is heavily service-oriented. We're a big food producer, but in fact, it's still a very small proportion of our economy. And manufacturing has been declining as a share for a long time. Another distinction among strategies is commodity exports versus import substitution industrialization or export-led industrialization. Commodity just means that you sell either agricultural goods or raw materials overseas. And for many developing countries, this was where they began under the colonial systems that basically dismantled their pre-existing manufacturing capacity and required them to import industrialized goods and export raw materials. In the post-colonial period, on the other hand, many developing countries have tried to industrialize. One way they can do that is to put up tariffs that keep out imported manufactured goods and reserve the home market for homegrown industries. And that allows your industries to grow without competition that from already established firms in the developed world. That strategy works for a while until you find out that over the long term it tends to reduce competition and reduces efficiencies. So eventually, what countries do is they begin to open their economy and to export, and they produce manufactured goods to export in the global economy. They use comparative advantage to specialize in certain kinds of goods, which they happen to have the right mix of labor and capital and raw materials to produce well. The countries that have succeeded the best through export-led industrialization are mostly in East Asia. And then finally, countries have a choice whether to rely upon domestic savings or international financing to spur capital investment. Domestic savings is preferable. It means that the current generation will have to do without some degree of consumption in order to generate savings that can go into investment. So that's a sacrifice, but the alternative is to borrow money from abroad, and doing that means going into debt. And many countries in Africa and Latin America especially have found that relying upon international debt is a recipe for eventual crisis. Now, you can find the PowerPoint for today's lecture online in the content tab. I'm not going to walk you through these examples, but here I'm listing in this PowerPoint slide some countries that combined these various paths, ingredients to development in different ways to produce different outcomes. Most of them having some degree of success, at least during particular periods of time. So, in conclusion, it's a very unequal world out there. It's far more unequal than it was any time prior to the last 2 centuries. Over those 2 centuries, we saw inequalities grow, especially among different regions of the world. Only in the last couple of decades have we begun to see developing countries catching up and inequality at the country level begin to decline, although at the individual level, the inequalities remain quite high. How do countries catch up? How do they develop? Well, we've talked about some of the ingredients and some of the choices countries have, and we noted that, in fact, there is no single correct recipe. What works for a given country depends on that country's geography, raw materials, its labor and capital supply, its government, and even its culture. All right, guys, stay safe. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.